Yusuf in Islam. The complete story of Prophet Yusuf. Introduction. A story of faith through every trial. Among the stories of the prophets in Islam, the story of Prophet Yusuf, peace be upon him, holds a unique place. It is the story of a young boy separated from his family, a brother betrayed by those closest to him, a slave taken to a foreign land, a man tested by temptation, a prisoner who remained faithful when freedom seemed impossible, and eventually a respected leader whose power gave him the opportunity to take revenge, but who instead chose forgiveness. The Qur'an presents the story of Yusuf in remarkable detail in Surah Yusuf, the 12th chapter of the Qur'an. Unlike many prophetic accounts that appear across different chapters, the story of Yusuf is presented as one connected narrative. Allah describes it as one of the best of stories, not simply because of the events themselves, but because beneath those events lies a profound lesson about faith, patience, destiny, human weakness, forgiveness, and the hidden wisdom of Allah. The story begins long before Yusuf becomes a powerful man in Egypt. It begins in the home of Prophet Yaqub, known in English as Jacob, peace be upon him. Yaqub was himself a prophet and the son of Prophet Ishaq, Isaac, peace be upon him. His family belonged to a blessed prophetic lineage connected to Prophet Abraham, peace be upon him. Yusuf was therefore born into a family of faith and prophecy. Yet being born into such a family did not mean that his life would be free from hardship. In fact, his life would become an extraordinary demonstration of how Allah can bring good out of circumstances that initially appear completely hopeless. The first scene of the story is a conversation between a young Yusuf and his father. The extraordinary dream. Yusuf was still young when he experienced a remarkable dream. He saw 11 stars, together with the sun and the moon, bowing before him. When he awoke, he did not understand what the dream meant. He knew only that it had been extraordinary. So he went to his father and told him what he had seen. Yaqub immediately understood that this was not an ordinary dream. He recognized that Allah was showing Yusuf something about his future. But Yaqub also understood that knowledge of a blessing can sometimes create danger when it is shared with people whose hearts are filled with jealousy. He therefore warned his son not to tell his brothers about the dream. This warning is one of the first important lessons in the story of Yusuf. Not every blessing needs to be announced. Not every dream needs to be shared. Not every success should be placed before everyone who knows us. Yaqub understood his sons. He knew that jealousy could become destructive. He feared that Yusuf's brothers might make a plan against him. The Qur'an records his warning that Yusuf should not reveal the dream to his brothers because they might devise a plot against him. Yaqub also told Yusuf that Allah would choose him, teach him the interpretation of events and dreams, and complete his favor upon him and the family of Yaqub. At that moment, Yusuf could not possibly have understood what these words would mean. He did not know that the dream would become connected to years of suffering. He did not know that his brothers would betray him. He did not know that he would be separated from his father. He did not know that he would be sold into slavery. He did not know that he would spend years behind prison walls. He did not know that one day he would stand in a position of authority over the very people who had caused his suffering. And most importantly, he did not know how Allah would connect every painful event to the fulfillment of a much greater plan. Jealousy begins to grow. Yusuf had brothers, and some of them became deeply jealous of him. The Qur'an tells us that they questioned why their father seemed to love Yusuf and his brother more than them, even though they were a group of strong brothers. Their jealousy gradually became a dangerous way of thinking. Instead of asking how they could earn their father's love, they began asking how they could remove Yusuf from their lives. This is an important distinction. Jealousy often begins in the heart before it becomes an action. A person may first compare himself with another person. Then he may become dissatisfied with what Allah has given him. Then he may begin to interpret another person's blessing as an insult to himself. Eventually, instead of wanting Allah to bless him too, he begins wishing that the other person would lose the blessing. That is what happened among Yusuf's brothers. Their thoughts became increasingly dark. They discussed killing Yusuf or sending him far away so that their father's attention would belong entirely to them. Eventually, one of them suggested that they should not kill him. Instead, they could throw him into the bottom of a well where some passing travelers might find him. Their plan was terrible, but they convinced themselves that after removing Yusuf, they could become righteous again and regain their father's affection. This reveals another danger of wrongdoing. People sometimes commit an injustice while telling themselves that everything will be better afterward. But sin rarely remains contained. One dishonest decision creates another. One lie requires another lie to protect it. One injustice requires another action to hide the first. Yusuf's brothers were about to discover this themselves. The request to take Yusuf. The brothers approached their father and asked him to allow Yusuf to go with them. They told Yaqub that they wanted Yusuf to come outside with them and enjoy himself. They promised that they would protect him. But Yaqub was concerned. He told them that it saddened him to send Yusuf away because he feared that a wolf might eat him while they were distracted. The brothers assured him that they were strong enough to protect Yusuf. Eventually, Yaqub allowed Yusuf to go with them. This moment is heartbreaking because the audience knows what Yusuf's father does not yet know. Yusuf leaves his home believing that he is going on an ordinary outing with his brothers. Instead, his brothers take him away from everything familiar. At some point, their plan is carried out. They take Yusuf and throw him into a deep well. Imagine the terror of that moment. Yusuf is still a young boy. The people surrounding him are his own brothers, the people who should have protected him. Instead, they have become the source of his greatest danger. He is separated from his family. He is left alone in darkness. Above him is the opening of the well. Around him are its walls. Below him is uncertainty. From a human perspective, this appears to be the end of his security. But from the perspective of Allah's plan, it is the beginning of another chapter. Allah does not abandon Yusuf. The Qur'an tells us that Allah revealed to Yusuf that one day he would remind his brothers of what they had done while they did not recognize him. This is one of the most powerful moments in the early story. Yusuf is physically abandoned by his brothers, but he is not abandoned by Allah. The difference is crucial. A person can lose his family, his wealth, his position, his home, and even his freedom. But none of these losses mean that Allah has abandoned him. Sometimes Allah's care is hidden inside circumstances that human beings cannot understand. Yusuf does not yet know where he is going. He does not know who will find him. He does not know what will happen to him. But Allah knows. The brothers return home and begin constructing their lie. They take Yusuf's shirt and put blood upon it. Then they return to their father at night, pretending to be deeply distressed. They tell Yaqub that they had gone racing and left Yusuf with their belongings, and that a wolf had eaten him. Then they present the blood-stained shirt as evidence. But Yaqub recognizes that something is wrong. A father who knows his children can sometimes recognize falsehood even when the story appears convincing. The Qur'an tells us that Yaqub did not accept their story. He understood that they had fabricated something. Yet what could he do? His beloved son was gone. The brothers had betrayed him. The evidence before him had been manipulated. Yaqub therefore responded with patience. He turned to Allah for help and relied upon him against what his sons had described. His response introduces one of the central themes of the entire story: beautiful patience. Beautiful patience does not mean that a person feels no pain. Yaqub was devastated. He grieved. He missed his son. But he refused to allow grief to destroy his relationship with Allah. He did not respond to suffering by abandoning faith. Instead, he endured. Yusuf is found. Meanwhile, Yusuf remained in the well. Eventually, travelers passed by. A man among them went to draw water. When he lowered his container into the well, Yusuf was discovered. The travelers were surprised to find a young boy. They pulled him out. For Yusuf, this was the moment when his life changed again, but it did not return him to his family. Instead, he was taken away and eventually sold. The Qur'an tells us that Yusuf was sold for a small price. The people who acquired him took him to Egypt. The young boy who had once lived in the home of a prophet was now being treated as property. The contrast is enormous. He had been the beloved son of Yaqub. Now he was a slave in a foreign land. He had once known the safety of his family. Now he was surrounded by strangers. He had once lived under the care of his father. Now his future depended upon people he had never met. Yet again, the story teaches that human beings see only one part of their lives. Yusuf could not see what was coming. Allah could. Yusuf arrives in Egypt. Yusuf was purchased by a man in Egypt who recognized that the young boy might become useful to the household. The Qur'an describes this man as the Aziz, a person of authority in Egypt. He instructed his wife to treat Yusuf well and suggested that he might benefit them or that they might adopt him as a son. This is another extraordinary turning point. The well had not been Yusuf's final destination. The slave market had not been his final destination. Allah was moving him toward a place where his character, knowledge, and patience would eventually have a much greater purpose. But Yusuf still had to endure many years before that purpose became clear. The Qur'an reminds us that Allah established Yusuf in the land and taught him the interpretation of events. The significance of this is profound. The same Allah who allowed Yusuf to experience the well was the Allah who was preparing him for his future. Sometimes a person looks at one painful event and asks, "Why did this happen to me?" But the answer may not be visible for years. The well can become the road to Egypt. Egypt can become the road to prison. Prison can become the road to authority. Authority can become the road to reunion. And reunion can become the moment when the meaning of the original dream finally becomes visible. The test of character. Yusuf grew into a young man of exceptional character. The Qur'an states that when he reached maturity, Allah gave him sound judgment and knowledge. But another major test was approaching. This test would not come from a well. It would not come from his brothers. It would come from temptation. Yusuf was living in the household of a powerful Egyptian man. As he grew older, the wife of the Aziz became attracted to him and attempted to seduce him. This was a completely different kind of trial. In the well, Yusuf had no control over his circumstances. Now he had a choice. He could pursue immediate desire, or he could remain faithful to Allah. The Quran describes the situation with seriousness. The woman closed the doors and invited Yusuf towards sin, but Yusuf refused. His response was rooted in consciousness of Allah. He recognized the betrayal involved in violating the trust of the household and, above all, recognized that Allah was watching. He chose righteousness even though temptation was directly in front of him. This is one of the most important lessons in the entire story. Faith is not proven only when temptation is absent. Faith is proven when temptation is powerful and a person still chooses Allah. Yusuf did not say that he would resist because he feared public embarrassment. He resisted because he feared Allah. He knew that a person can hide an action from people, but cannot hide it from his Creator. Yusuf runs toward the door. The situation became increasingly intense. Yusuf moved toward the door, attempting to escape. The woman followed him. As he reached the door, she grabbed his shirt from behind and tore it. At that exact moment, the husband arrived. Now the situation became a question of accusation and credibility. The woman immediately accused Yusuf. She attempted to portray him as the aggressor. Yusuf, however, declared his innocence. The truth had to be established. Someone from the household proposed examining Yusuf's shirt. If the shirt was torn from the front, it could indicate that Yusuf had been approaching her. But if it was torn from the back, it would support Yusuf's claim that he had been fleeing from her. The shirt was found torn from the back. The evidence revealed the truth. Yusuf had not been the aggressor. The woman had pursued him. The husband recognized what had happened and instructed Yusuf to keep the matter private. But the story did not remain private. The incident began circulating among women in the city. They criticized the wife of the Aziz and were amazed that she had become attracted to a young man under her authority. The situation soon became another trial for Yusuf. The women of the city. The wife of the Aziz wanted the women to understand why she had become so captivated by Yusuf. She invited them to a gathering and provided them with fruit and knives. Then she brought Yusuf before them. When the women saw him, they were so astonished by his appearance that they cut their hands while distracted, realizing that they had encountered a young man of extraordinary beauty. The incident demonstrated how powerful physical attraction can become when people allow their desires to control their judgment. Yet Yusuf remained firm. The women encouraged him toward the same temptation, but Yusuf preferred prison to committing the sin they were asking him to commit. This decision reveals something extraordinary about his character. He did not merely ask Allah to remove the temptation. He asked Allah to protect him from the temptation, even if the price was imprisonment. Yusuf understood that physical freedom without spiritual freedom is not true freedom. A person can live outside prison and still be a prisoner of desire. Another person can live behind prison walls and remain spiritually free. Yusuf chose righteousness over comfort. He chose obedience over immediate pleasure. He chose Allah over the world. Eventually, Yusuf was imprisoned despite his innocence. From a worldly perspective, it seemed deeply unfair. He had been betrayed by his brothers. He had been sold as a slave. He had resisted temptation. He had been proven innocent. And yet, he was still imprisoned. But the story was not over. In fact, another chapter was beginning. The prison that appeared to be another disaster would become the place where Yusuf's remarkable gift of interpreting dreams would bring him into contact with a future path toward freedom. And the young boy who had once been thrown into a well would soon become the man whose wisdom would influence the fate of an entire nation. His journey from the darkness of the well to the confinement of the prison was not a series of meaningless tragedies. It was a journey being shaped by a wisdom far beyond what Yusuf could see. And this is where the next chapter of his life begins. Prison, dreams, and the beginning of Yusuf's rise. The prison should have been the place where Yusuf's story became smaller. Instead, it became the place where his character became even greater. Yusuf had already experienced a remarkable series of trials. He had been separated from his father and thrown into a well by his own brothers. He had been taken to a foreign land and sold as a slave. He had grown into a young man in Egypt, only to face a powerful temptation. When he refused to disobey Allah, he was imprisoned despite his innocence. From a human perspective, his life seemed to be moving in the wrong direction. He had gone from being the beloved son of a prophet to being a rejected brother, from a free child to a slave, from a respected member of a household to an accused man, and finally from an innocent man to a prisoner. Yet Yusuf did not allow his circumstances to determine the quality of his character. He remained faithful. He remained patient. He remained useful to others. And this is one of the most important features of his story. Yusuf did not wait until his circumstances improved before becoming a good servant of Allah. He served Allah where he was. Yusuf in prison. Yusuf entered prison as an innocent man. The Qur'an does not present prison as the end of his hope. Instead, it shows Yusuf continuing to live with faith and wisdom. There were other prisoners around him, people carrying their own histories, fears, and uncertainties. Some had been imprisoned because of crimes, while others were caught in circumstances they could not control. Among them were two young men who would become important to Yusuf's future. One day, both men experienced dreams. The dreams troubled them, and they sought someone who could explain their meaning. They eventually turned to Yusuf. But before Yusuf interpreted their dreams, something remarkable happened. He used the opportunity to speak to them about Allah. This reveals a profound aspect of Yusuf's character. He did not treat people merely as opportunities to display his knowledge. He cared about their spiritual condition. He understood that the ability to interpret dreams was not simply a talent belonging to him independently. It was knowledge that Allah had given him. So before giving the interpretation, Yusuf explained his belief. He told them that the food they were about to receive would be known to him before it arrived, because this was knowledge taught to him by his Lord. He then explained that he had rejected the religion of people who did not believe in Allah, and instead followed the faith of his fathers, Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub. Yusuf reminded them that it was not appropriate to associate partners with Allah. Then he asked them a question that reached the heart of their situation. Was it better to worship many separate gods, or to worship Allah, the One, the Supreme? This was Yusuf's method. Even in prison, he was calling people toward truth. His circumstances had not silenced him. His suffering had not made him bitter. His imprisonment had not convinced him that life was meaningless. Instead, his hardship became another place where he demonstrated faith. The two dreams. After explaining the foundations of his faith, Yusuf interpreted the dreams. One of the prisoners had dreamed that he was pressing grapes for wine. The other had dreamed that he was carrying bread on his head while birds were eating from it. Yusuf explained that the first man would eventually return to serving wine to his master. The second would be executed, and birds would eat from his head. The interpretation was direct and serious. Then Yusuf told the man whom he expected to survive to mention him to his master when he returned to his position. This was not a demand for injustice. Yusuf was simply asking the man to remember that an innocent person remained in prison. But something important happened. The man forgot. The Qur'an tells us that Satan caused him to forget mentioning Yusuf to his master, and Yusuf remained in prison for several more years. This is another moment where the story teaches patience. Yusuf had interpreted the dream correctly. He had a reason to hope. He expected that the surviving prisoner might remember him, but nothing happened. Days became months. Months became years. The door remained closed. The answer did not arrive when Yusuf expected it. And yet, Allah's timing was preparing something much larger. If Yusuf had been released at that earlier moment, he might have left prison as an ordinary innocent man. Instead, Allah would bring about his release at a moment when Egypt itself would need him. The King's Dream. Years passed. Then the ruler of Egypt experienced a disturbing dream. He saw 7 fat cows being eaten by 7 lean cows. He also saw 7 green ears of grain and 7 others that were dry. The dream troubled him deeply. He called the people around him and asked them to explain it, but none of them could provide a satisfactory interpretation. The king's advisors were unable to solve the mystery. Then, suddenly, the former prisoner remembered Yusuf. The man who had once been imprisoned with Yusuf was now free and serving the ruler. He realized that the person capable of interpreting the king's dream was the man he had forgotten. He went to Yusuf, and Yusuf explained the dream. He said that Egypt would experience 7 years of abundant harvest. During those years, the people should cultivate their crops diligently and preserve most of what they harvested, leaving only a small amount for consumption. After those 7 years of abundance would come 7 extremely difficult years. During those years, the stored grain would be needed. Then Yusuf described another year that would come afterward, a year in which the people would receive relief and abundance once again. This interpretation was more than an explanation of a dream. It was a complete economic strategy. Yusuf had not merely said that famine was coming. He had identified the period of abundance, the period of scarcity, and the practical method by which Egypt could survive the crisis. He understood that food would need to be stored. He understood that resources would need to be managed carefully. He understood that prosperity should not lead to waste. He understood that preparation during good years could determine whether people survived bad years. The king was deeply impressed. The prisoner whom everyone had forgotten had become the person capable of solving the greatest problem facing Egypt. Yusuf refuses to leave immediately. The king ordered that Yusuf be brought before him. But Yusuf did not simply rush out of prison. This is one of the most remarkable moments in the story. Yusuf wanted the truth of his innocence to become clear before he left. He did not want to walk out of prison while the false accusations surrounding him remained unresolved. He asked the king's messenger to return to the king and ask him about the women who had previously cut their hands. Yusuf wanted the investigation to be reopened. He wanted the truth to be established. This demonstrates that patience does not mean accepting injustice forever when justice can legitimately be pursued. Yusuf had trusted Allah throughout his imprisonment, but he also understood the importance of establishing the truth. The king questioned the women involved. He asked them what had happened when they attempted to tempt Yusuf. They admitted the truth. They declared that they knew nothing evil about him. Then the wife of the Aziz finally acknowledged her own wrongdoing. She admitted that she had attempted to seduce Yusuf and that he had been truthful. The truth that had been hidden for years was finally revealed. Yusuf had been innocent all along. The prison had not been the result of his guilt. It had been the result of his refusal to commit sin, and now the people of Egypt knew it. Innocence becomes clear. This moment is important because Yusuf did not simply want freedom. He wanted his reputation to be restored. There is a difference between escaping punishment and establishing truth. Yusuf could have left prison quietly. Instead, he wanted the circumstances that led to his imprisonment to be investigated. The women testified. The truth emerged. The accusation against Yusuf collapsed. The king recognized that Yusuf was trustworthy. And now the man who had entered prison under suspicion was about to leave with honor. This was another reversal in the story. The same society that had once treated Yusuf as a prisoner was now recognizing his integrity. But Yusuf's greatest rise was still ahead. Yusuf offers his service. The king brought Yusuf before him. After learning about his intelligence, honesty, and ability to manage the coming crisis, Yusuf was given an opportunity to take responsibility for the nation's food resources. Yusuf requested authority over the storehouses of the land. He described himself as a trustworthy and knowledgeable guardian. This is sometimes misunderstood. In ordinary circumstances, a person should be careful about seeking power merely for personal ambition. But Yusuf's situation was different. He knew that a severe famine was approaching. He knew what needed to be done. He knew that he possessed the knowledge and integrity necessary to manage the resources. If he remained silent, people could suffer. His request was therefore connected to responsibility rather than personal glory. Yusuf was not asking for authority because he wanted luxury. He was offering himself for a difficult task because he knew he could perform it faithfully. This is an important lesson about leadership. Leadership is not simply about having power. It is about accepting responsibility. A leader must possess knowledge, trustworthiness, and the willingness to serve people during difficult circumstances. Yusuf demonstrated all three. Yusuf's rise to authority. Allah established Yusuf in the land. The young man who had once been thrown into a well now held an important position in Egypt. The prisoner had become an administrator. The slave had become a trusted official. The accused man had become a respected leader. The abandoned child had become a person responsible for protecting the population from famine. None of this happened because Yusuf manipulated events. It happened through a chain of circumstances that Allah had allowed to unfold. This is one of the deepest messages of the story. Sometimes Allah takes a person through a path that appears to be moving backward. Yusuf went from home to from the well to slavery, from slavery to accusation, from accusation to prison, and from prison to authority. At every stage, the apparent disaster was connected to a later blessing. But there was something even more important than Yusuf's new position. Allah had not simply elevated Yusuf. Allah had prepared him for the responsibility. The years of hardship had developed qualities that power would require. The boy who had experienced betrayal understood human weakness. The young man who had resisted temptation understood self-control. The prisoner who had endured injustice understood patience. The believer who had relied upon Allah understood humility. These qualities would now become essential to his leadership. The 7 years of abundance. The years of prosperity arrived exactly as Yusuf had predicted. Egypt experienced abundant harvests. The agricultural resources were carefully managed. Yusuf's strategy ensured that the grain was preserved. The people benefited from the abundance, but they also prepared for the future. This is another lesson of Yusuf's story. Good times should not make people forget that circumstances change. Prosperity can create the illusion that today's conditions will continue forever. But Yusuf understood that abundance itself could be a test. Would people waste their resources? Would they consume everything immediately? Would leaders prepare for future hardship? The correct response to prosperity was responsible preparation. Yusuf's administration therefore transformed the years of abundance into protection against the coming famine. Then the 7 years of hardship arrived. The land around Egypt experienced severe scarcity. People needed food, and Egypt became a place where resources were available because Yusuf had prepared for the crisis. The famine did not affect Egypt alone. It reached surrounding lands. People traveled from different regions seeking grain. Among those who eventually traveled to Egypt were Yusuf's own brothers. This was the beginning of one of the most extraordinary reunions in the entire story. Yusuf's brothers come to Egypt. Yusuf's brothers arrived in Egypt seeking provisions. They did not recognize him. Years had passed since they had thrown him into the well. They had no reason to imagine that the powerful official responsible for Egypt's food supplies could be the same boy they had once abandoned. But Yusuf recognized them. He knew exactly who they were. This was the moment when the past suddenly stood before him. Imagine what Yusuf must have remembered. He could have remembered the well. He could have remembered their betrayal. He could have remembered the fear and loneliness of that night. He could have remembered being sold. He could have remembered the pain of separation from his father. He could have remembered the years in Egypt. He could have remembered prison. And now those same brothers were standing before him. But Yusuf did not immediately reveal his identity. Instead, he spoke with them and asked about their family. He learned that they had another brother who had remained with their father. This younger brother was Yusuf's full brother, and Yusuf wanted them to bring him the next time they came for provisions. He instructed them that they would not receive provisions in the future unless they brought their brother with them. The brothers returned home, but Yusuf had set in motion the next stage of the story. Yaqub's pain returns. When the brothers returned to their father, they explained that the Egyptian official had demanded that they bring their younger brother. Yaqub immediately became concerned. He had already lost Yusuf. He remembered the previous promise that his sons would protect him. He did not want to experience another tragedy. The brothers assured him that they would protect their younger brother. Eventually, Yaqub agreed, but only after they gave him a serious promise before Allah that they would return him safely. This moment shows how deeply the wound of Yusuf's disappearance had affected Yaqub. The passage of years had not erased the pain. A parent can continue carrying grief long after everyone else assumes that time has healed it. Yet Yaqub remained a man of faith. He trusted Allah while taking reasonable precautions. He instructed his sons to enter Egypt through different gates, rather than all entering together. He understood that precautions should be taken, but he also acknowledged that nothing could protect them against Allah's decree. His trust was not passive. He combined planning with reliance upon Allah. The younger brother returns to Egypt. The brothers eventually returned to Egypt with their younger brother. Yusuf saw him. For Yusuf, this was deeply emotional. He privately revealed his identity to his brother. He told him not to grieve over what the other brothers had done. At last, Yusuf had found his full brother again. But Yusuf's plan was not yet complete. He needed to keep his brother with him. A strategy was therefore carried out involving the king's drinking cup. The cup was placed among the belongings of Yusuf's brother, and then the caravan was searched. When the cup was found, the brothers were confronted with the accusation that someone had taken the king's property. The brothers were devastated. They had promised their father that they would protect their younger brother. Now they appeared to have failed. They argued and attempted to negotiate. But Yusuf's plan succeeded. His brother remained in Egypt. The other brothers were forced to return to their father without him. For Yaqub, this was another devastating blow. He had lost Yusuf many years earlier. Now he had lost another son. His grief became even greater. Yet, even in this agony, Yaqub did not abandon faith. He said that he would remain patient with beautiful patience. He turned away from them and grieved privately. The Qur'an describes his eyes becoming white from grief because of the intensity of his sorrow. His sons noticed his suffering and urged him to stop remembering Yusuf. But Yaqub answered with words revealing the depth of his relationship with Allah. He said that he complained only of his suffering and grief to Allah, and that he knew from Allah what they did not know. This statement is central to understanding prophetic patience. Yaqub did not deny his grief. He did not pretend that losing his sons did not hurt. He took his pain directly to Allah. There is a difference between complaining about Allah and complaining to Allah. Yaqub did not accuse Allah of injustice. He did not lose hope. Instead, he brought his sorrow before his Lord, and he continued to believe that Allah knew what he did not know. The brothers return once again. The famine continued. The brothers eventually returned to Egypt again. This time, their circumstances were desperate. They had little wealth left. They asked for provisions and appealed to the generosity of the Egyptian official. Yusuf's brothers still did not recognize him. But now Yusuf was ready to confront the truth. He asked them whether they remembered what they had done to Yusuf and his brother when they were ignorant. The question shocked them. They looked at him carefully. Then they realized the man standing before them was Yusuf, the brother they had betrayed, the brother they had thrown into the well, the brother they had assumed was gone, the brother whose disappearance had caused their father's grief for years. Yusuf was alive, and he was powerful. The brothers were overwhelmed. They recognized their wrongdoing, but Yusuf did not respond with revenge. Instead, he told them that there would be no blame upon them that day. He forgave them. This is one of the greatest moments in the story. Yusuf finally had the power to punish the people who had destroyed his childhood. He could have humiliated them. He could have imprisoned them. He could have denied them food. He could have demanded compensation. He could have reminded them of every moment of his suffering. But he chose forgiveness. The person who had once been powerless now possessed enormous authority, and his greatest demonstration of power was that he refused to abuse it. The shirt and the return to Yaqub. Yusuf gave his brothers his shirt and instructed them to take it to their father. He told them to place it over Yaqub's face and that his eyesight would return. The brothers then returned home. Before they even arrived, Yaqub sensed that something was happening. He told those around him that he could smell Yusuf. They may have thought his grief had overwhelmed him, but the moment came. The shirt arrived. It was placed upon Yaqub's face. His sight returned. After years of grief, the father who had wept for his missing son received a sign that Yusuf was alive. The brothers confessed their wrongdoing. They asked their father to seek forgiveness for them. Yaqub agreed. And now the family was preparing for the reunion that had seemed impossible for decades. The family of Yaqub would travel to Egypt. Yusuf would finally see his father again. The dream of the 11 stars, the sun, and the moon was approaching its fulfillment. But the meaning of that dream would only become fully clear when the entire family stood together before Yusuf. And that moment would bring the story toward its most beautiful conclusion. Reunion, forgiveness, the fulfillment of the dream, and the lessons of Yusuf. The journey that had begun with a young boy standing beside his father was now approaching its final and most beautiful moment. Years earlier, Yusuf had told his father about a remarkable dream. He had seen 11 stars, the sun and the moon bowing before him. At that time, the dream seemed mysterious. No one could have imagined how many years of suffering would stand between that dream and its fulfillment. Yusuf had been separated from his family. His brothers had betrayed him. His father had mourned him. He had been thrown into a well. He had been sold as a slave. He had lived in a foreign land. He had faced temptation. He had been falsely accused. He had spent years in prison. He had eventually become a trusted authority in Egypt. And now, after all those years, his family was coming to him. The dream that had begun the story was finally reaching its conclusion. The family travels to Egypt. Yaqub and his family traveled toward Egypt. They were no longer the same family they had been when Yusuf disappeared. The brothers had grown older. Their father had carried years of grief. The family had experienced famine, separation, and regret. But they were now being brought together again through circumstances that none of them could have planned themselves. When Yusuf saw his family approaching, he welcomed them. He brought his parents into the place of security and honor and told them to enter Egypt, if Allah willed, in safety. The moment must have been extraordinary for everyone involved. Yaqub was finally standing before the son he had mourned for so many years. The brothers were standing before the brother they had once betrayed. And Yusuf was standing before the people connected to every stage of his suffering and every stage of his journey toward greatness. The past and present had finally met. The fulfillment of Yusuf's dream. Then the family bowed before Yusuf in honor. At that moment, Yusuf recognized the fulfillment of the dream he had experienced as a child. The 11 stars represented his brothers. The sun and the moon represented his parents, according to the traditional understanding of the Quranic passage. The dream had taken years to reach its fulfillment, but it had not been forgotten. This is one of the most powerful lessons in the story of Yusuf. A promise from Allah does not become false simply because its fulfillment takes a long time. Human beings often measure life in days, months, and years. Allah's plan is not limited by our sense of timing. Yusuf's dream was true when he was a child, even though decades would pass before its meaning became visible. The dream was not canceled by the well. It was not canceled by slavery. It was not canceled by temptation. It was not canceled by prison. Every apparent setback was part of the road toward its fulfillment. Yusuf looks back. Now Yusuf could look back over his entire life. He could remember the moment his brothers threw him into the well. He could remember the fear. He could remember being sold. He could remember leaving his homeland. He could remember entering the household of the Aziz. He could remember the temptation and the accusation. He could remember prison. He could remember the forgotten prisoner. He could remember the king's dream. He could remember the years of abundance and famine. He could remember the first time his brothers appeared before him without recognizing him. He could remember his younger brother. He could remember the pain that returned to his father. And now everything had led to this moment. But Yusuf did not interpret his life as a collection of meaningless tragedies. He recognized Allah's wisdom. He said that his Lord had made the dream come true and had been good to him when he brought him out of prison and brought his family from the desert after Satan had caused discord between him and his brothers. Notice the extraordinary way Yusuf described his past. He did not focus on revenge. He did not stand before his brothers and list every injustice they had committed. He did not say, "You destroyed my life." Instead, he recognized the hand of Allah throughout his journey. He acknowledged that Allah had been good to him. This does not mean the suffering was insignificant. It means that the final outcome gave Yusuf a perspective that he could not have possessed when he was inside the trial. Yusuf does not humiliate his brothers. Yusuf had every worldly reason to remind his brothers of their wrongdoing. He had authority. They were dependent upon Egypt for food. They were vulnerable. They had already admitted their guilt. But Yusuf did not humiliate them. His forgiveness was not weakness. It was strength under control. He could have taken revenge, but he chose mercy. This is one of the central moral lessons of his story. Forgiveness is especially powerful when a person possesses the ability to retaliate, but deliberately chooses not to. Yusuf had experienced injustice, but he refused to become unjust himself. He had been betrayed, but he refused to betray. He had been humiliated, but he refused to humiliate. He had been treated without mercy, but he chose mercy. This is the character of a person whose heart has been transformed by faith. Yusuf's final reflection. After everything had been resolved, Yusuf turned his attention toward Allah. He recognized that all the power he had received, all the knowledge he possessed, and all the circumstances that had unfolded were ultimately from Allah. He understood that worldly authority was temporary. He understood that knowledge was a gift. He understood that his success was not simply the result of his own intelligence. The young boy who had once stood beside Yaqub had become a powerful man. But his greatest achievement was not becoming powerful. His greatest achievement was remaining faithful while passing through powerlessness, temptation, suffering, and power. That is why the story of Yusuf is much deeper than a story about political success or family reunion. It is a story about the formation of a human soul. Yusuf's prayer. Near the conclusion of his story, Yusuf turned toward Allah with a profound prayer. He acknowledged the blessings Allah had given him and his parents. He asked Allah to remain his protector in this world and the next. He asked to die in submission to Allah and to be joined with the righteous. This prayer reveals Yusuf's priorities. After everything he had achieved, his ultimate concern was not wealth. It was not political power. It was not recognition. It was not revenge. It was not even the preservation of his worldly position. His ultimate concern was to remain a servant of Allah. This is the final measure of success in Islam. A person may become wealthy and still fail. A person may become powerful and still fail. A person may become famous and still fail. A person may gain the admiration of people and still lose what matters most. True success is to live with faith and to return to Allah in a state of submission. Yusuf understood this. The meaning of Yusuf's story. The story of Yusuf contains lessons for almost every stage of human life. It begins with family. Yusuf's earliest trial came from people who were closest to him. This teaches us that family relationships can contain both love and difficulty. Jealousy can enter families. Comparison can destroy relationships. One person's blessing can become another person's source of resentment. The story therefore teaches us to be careful about envy. If Allah has blessed another person, we should not see that blessing as evidence that Allah has forgotten us. Allah's generosity is not limited. Someone else's success does not require our failure. Someone else's beauty does not reduce our worth. Someone else's knowledge does not make us ignorant. Someone else's provision does not diminish what Allah has written for us. The brothers of Yusuf made the mistake of believing that removing Yusuf would increase their own value. It did not. Their jealousy only brought years of guilt, pain, and separation. The lesson of patience. The word patience does not fully capture the depth of what Yusuf and Yaqub experienced. Yusuf had to be patient when he was abandoned. He had to be patient when he was sold. He had to be patient when he was falsely accused. He had to be patient in prison. Yaqub had to be patient when he lost Yusuf. He had to be patient when the brothers returned without him. He had to be patient while grieving. Yet neither man allowed patience to become hopelessness. This distinction matters. Islamic patience is not the belief that nothing can improve. It is the ability to remain faithful while waiting for Allah's wisdom to become clear. Sometimes the answer arrives quickly. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes a person may not see the complete wisdom during his lifetime. But faith teaches the believer that Allah's knowledge is greater than human knowledge. The lesson of temptation. Yusuf's encounter with temptation provides another powerful lesson. He was young. He was physically attractive. He was in a vulnerable position. The person tempting him had authority. The doors were closed. The opportunity for secrecy existed. Yet Yusuf remembered Allah. This demonstrates that righteousness is not dependent upon being in an easy environment. A person may be surrounded by temptation and still choose obedience. The Quranic account of Yusuf also teaches that resisting temptation may sometimes come with an immediate worldly cost. Yusuf chose prison rather than sin. This is important because people sometimes expect obedience to Allah to make life immediately easier. That is not always the case. Sometimes obedience creates a temporary difficulty. Sometimes saying no to something forbidden means losing an opportunity. Sometimes maintaining integrity means losing money, status, a relationship, or comfort. But the believer measures success differently. Yusuf's prison sentence was temporary. His integrity became part of his permanent legacy. The lesson of reputation and truth. Yusuf was falsely accused. The accusation could have destroyed his reputation, but eventually the truth emerged. This teaches another important principle. Human beings may judge based on incomplete information. People may believe rumors. They may misunderstand events. They may accept accusations without investigation. But Allah knows the truth. Yusuf's life demonstrates that a person's innocence does not depend upon everyone's immediate recognition of it. There may be periods when a righteous person is misunderstood. The appropriate response is to remain truthful and to take legitimate steps to establish the truth when necessary. Yusuf did not respond to false accusation by committing another wrong. He waited until the truth could be established. The lesson of prison. Yusuf's prison experience teaches us that a difficult place does not have to become a meaningless place. He could have spent his years complaining. Instead, he helped people. He interpreted dreams. He taught about Allah. He encouraged faith. He remained intellectually active. He maintained his character. This is a powerful lesson for anyone experiencing a difficult period. Sometimes a person cannot immediately change his circumstances, but he can decide what kind of person he will be inside those circumstances. A difficult environment does not automatically justify bad character. A painful experience does not require bitterness. A delay does not require despair. Yusuf transformed his prison from merely a place of confinement into a place where his faith and wisdom became visible. The lesson of leadership. When Yusuf finally received authority, his previous hardships became valuable preparation. He understood scarcity because he had experienced deprivation. He understood trust because he had experienced betrayal. He understood responsibility because he had experienced vulnerability. He understood the value of preparation because he had learned that circumstances can change suddenly. He therefore became a leader capable of managing a national crisis. His leadership was not simply about controlling resources. It was about protecting people. This is a central Islamic principle of leadership. Authority is an amana, a trust. Power should not exist merely for personal benefit. A leader should understand that responsibility will ultimately be accountable before Allah. Yusuf's example shows how knowledge and trustworthiness can be combined to serve society. The lesson of forgiveness. Perhaps the most emotionally powerful lesson of the story is forgiveness. Yusuf's brothers had done something terrible to him. Yet when the moment of power arrived, Yusuf did not choose revenge. He forgave them. His forgiveness does not erase the wrong they committed. Rather, it demonstrates that a person can acknowledge injustice without allowing injustice to control his future. This is a crucial distinction. Forgiveness does not mean pretending that harm never happened. It does not mean calling evil good. It does not mean refusing justice when justice is necessary. In Yusuf's case, however, he chose mercy when he had the power to retaliate. That decision revealed the greatness of his character. The lesson of Allah's hidden plan. Perhaps the deepest lesson of Yusuf's story is that human beings rarely see the entire plan. When Yusuf was thrown into the well, he could not see Egypt. When he was sold, he could not see his future position. When he was falsely accused, he could not see his eventual reputation. When he entered prison, he could not see the king's dream. When the prisoner forgot him, he could not see why the delay was necessary. Yet every stage was connected. The well led to Egypt. Egypt led to the household of the Aziz. The household led to the trial. The trial led to prison. Prison led to the interpretation of the king's dream. The dream led to authority. Authority led to the management of the famine. The famine brought Yusuf's brothers back to him. Their return created the opportunity for reconciliation. And reconciliation eventually brought Yaqub and the entire family to Egypt. The events that appeared disconnected were actually connected by a wisdom Yusuf could only understand much later. This is why the story can provide comfort to believers who are experiencing uncertainty. A person may be living in the middle of his story. He may not know what the next chapter contains. He may be looking at an event that appears completely negative. He may be asking why Allah has allowed something to happen. The story of Yusuf teaches that the middle of a story is not the same thing as its ending. The meaning of beautiful patience. Yaqub's concept of beautiful patience is particularly important. Beautiful patience does not require a person to stop feeling sadness. Yaqub cried. He grieved. His eyes were affected by the intensity of his sorrow. His love for Yusuf was real. His pain was real. But his faith remained real too. This is a powerful reminder that sadness is not automatically a sign of weak faith. A believer can cry and still trust Allah. A believer can grieve and still pray. A believer can feel broken and still believe that Allah is wise. Faith does not require human beings to become emotionless. Instead, faith teaches them where to take their emotions. Yaqub took his grief to Allah. Yusuf and the meaning of destiny. The story also teaches a balanced understanding of destiny. The brothers made a deliberate choice to harm Yusuf. Their wrongdoing was real. Their jealousy was real. Their actions had consequences. Yet Allah's plan was greater than their plan. They intended to remove Yusuf. Allah ultimately established him. They wanted him far away. Allah brought him to Egypt. They wanted to weaken him. Allah prepared him for leadership. They wanted to separate him from his father. Allah eventually reunited the family. This does not mean that wrongdoing becomes good simply because Allah can bring good consequences from it. Rather, it demonstrates that human beings cannot defeat Allah's ultimate wisdom. People can make plans, they can make choices, they can commit injustice, but Allah remains sovereign over the final outcome. Yusuf's story and human relationships. The story also gives us a profound understanding of family relationships. The brothers were not simply villains. They were human beings who allowed jealousy to overcome conscience. Later, they regretted their actions. They recognized their wrongdoing. They sought forgiveness. And Yusuf accepted their repentance. This reminds us that people can change. A person's worst action does not necessarily have to become his final identity. The brothers who once betrayed Yusuf eventually stood before him, acknowledging their guilt. Their transformation was part of the story. Yusuf's forgiveness allowed the family to move forward. Why Allah calls it one of the best stories. Surah Yusuf contains one of the most complete narratives in the Qur'an. It includes childhood, family conflict, jealousy, separation, slavery, temptation, false accusation, imprisonment, dreams, leadership, famine, reunion, and forgiveness. But its greatness does not come merely from the number of events. Its greatness comes from the spiritual meaning within those events. The story shows that faith can survive betrayal. It shows that purity can survive temptation. It shows that patience can survive delay. It shows that truth can survive false accusation. It shows that wisdom can emerge from suffering. It shows that power can be used for mercy. And it shows that Allah can transform a situation that appears hopeless into something filled with wisdom. The final image of Yusuf. Imagine Yusuf at the end of his life. The young boy who once stood before his father with a mysterious dream had become a mature man who had experienced almost every kind of human trial. He had known love, he had known jealousy, he had known loneliness, he had known slavery, he had known temptation, he had known injustice, he had known imprisonment, he had known authority, he had known responsibility, he had known forgiveness. And after all of it, his heart still turned toward Allah. That is the real victory of Yusuf. Not the position he achieved, not the wealth he controlled, not the authority he possessed, not even the reunion with his family. His greatest victory was that the trials of life did not separate him from his Lord. Conclusion: the journey from the well to the palace. The story of Yusuf begins in a peaceful home and quickly moves into darkness. A young boy is betrayed by his brothers. He is thrown into a well. He is taken to a foreign country. He is sold. He grows up surrounded by temptation. He refuses sin. He is falsely accused. He enters prison. He waits. He interprets dreams. He is remembered. He interprets the king's dream. He is released with his innocence established. He receives authority. He manages the resources of Egypt. A famine arrives. His brothers come seeking food. They stand before him without recognizing him. Eventually, they recognize their brother. He forgives them. His father comes. The family is reunited. The childhood dream is fulfilled. And Yusuf turns toward Allah. What began with a dream ends with gratitude. What began with jealousy ends with forgiveness. What began with separation ends with reunion. What began with the well ends in honor. And what seemed like a collection of disasters is revealed as a journey guided by divine wisdom. The story of Yusuf teaches us not that believers will never suffer. It teaches us something more profound. A believer may suffer and still be protected. A believer may be delayed and still be progressing. A believer may be misunderstood and still be known by Allah. A believer may lose something precious and later discover that Allah was preparing something beyond what he could imagine. Yusuf's life reminds us that the darkness of one moment cannot tell us the meaning of the entire journey. The well was not the end. The prison was not the end. The accusation was not the end. The separation was not the end. Allah had written a greater conclusion. And that is why the story of Yusuf continues to speak to people across generations. It speaks to the person who has been betrayed. It speaks to the person who has been misunderstood. It speaks to the person struggling with temptation. It speaks to the person waiting for relief. It speaks to the person grieving someone they love. It speaks to the person who has lost hope because life has not unfolded according to expectations. and it speaks to the person who has finally received a blessing after years of difficulty. The lesson is not that every painful experience will end exactly as Yusuf's did. Our lives are different, and Allah's wisdom is beyond our ability to predict. The lesson is that Allah remains Allah through every stage. When the believer understands this, patience becomes possible, hope becomes possible, forgiveness becomes possible, and even during the most difficult chapter, the believer can continue walking forward with faith. Yusuf's story, therefore, does not simply ask us to remember what happened to a prophet in the past. It asks us to examine our own hearts. When someone else receives a blessing, do we become jealous? When we are tempted, do we remember Allah? When we are treated unfairly, do we remain truthful? When life becomes difficult, do we become hopeless? When we receive authority, do we become arrogant? And when someone who has harmed us finally becomes vulnerable before us, do we choose revenge or forgiveness? These questions are part of the legacy of Yusuf. His story is not merely about what happened to him. It is about what his life teaches us about ourselves. And perhaps that is why this story remains so powerful. A child entered a well. A prisoner entered a cell. A leader entered a position of power. But throughout every transformation, Yusuf remained a servant of Allah. And when everything he had lost was eventually returned to him, he did not become attached to the worldly success. He turned his heart toward the one who had guided him through every stage. That is the final lesson of Yusuf. The world changes. People change. Circumstances change. Fortune changes. Power changes hands. But Allah's wisdom does not change. And sometimes, when a person looks back after years of hardship, he may finally understand that the road he thought was leading him away from his destination was actually the road Allah was using to bring him there. The story of Yusuf begins with a dream. It passes through a well. It passes through slavery. It passes through temptation. It passes through prison. It rises into leadership. It returns to the family. And it ends with gratitude to Allah. It is a story of patience without despair, strength without arrogance, power without revenge, and forgiveness without forgetting the truth. It is the story of Yusuf, peace be upon him. And it remains, for those who reflect upon it, a timeless reminder that the darkest chapter of a person's life may not be the end of the story. Sometimes it is only the beginning of what Allah has planned.